Welcome to Legends. My guest tonight is my ultimate hero. It's none other than Lefty Kreh. Lefty, thanks for being on this segment.
Thanks for embarrassing me.
Yeah, well, I had to do it, you know. Listen, Lefty, there's something I always wanted to ask you. You've been doing fly fishing and fly casting for many, many years. Who was the first person who started you on fly fishing?
Well, young people today probably never heard of him, but Joe Brooks, who was back in the 40s, 50s, early 60s, was the leading fishing writer in the country, really. He lived near Baltimore, and I took him fishing. Did some smallmouth guiding at the time on the Potomac River in Maryland, and Joe asked me to take him fishing, and I only knew one old man that fished with a fly. In those days, in Maryland, there were virtually no fly fishermen. And this old man used to fish on little streams with a little 4 or 5-weight rod. Anyway, Joe asked me to take him. We went up to Harper's Ferry, which is where the Blue Ridge Mountains have been cut through, so there's wind in that sort of canyon there. And he got in the boat with what would be now a 9-weight rod called a GAF in those days. Okay. And
I've seen those around.
Yeah, and I said to him, he was very much of a gentleman, and it was my first day of fishing with him. Of course, I knew who he was, but I said, Joe, if you don't have any other tackle with you, I'll lend you some of mine. Now, in those days, we used mostly plug tackle. Spinning was just starting to come in. And he said, well, what's the problem? And I said, well, it's pretty windy. It was blowing about 15 miles an hour, which at that time I thought was terrible wind to fly cast in. And he said, well, if you don't mind, I'd like to try it. Well, nobody that I know has ever caught more fish than the local top guy on his water. But Joe caught almost as many water fish as I did, and I was a so-called expert.
And he was fly casting.
He was fly casting. And what sold me was we stopped for lunch on a ledge that pointed upstream. The current was coming this way, and we ate lunch down here, and we walked up to the top. He did with his rod. And I now know what was going on. Didn't know anything at that time. He pulled this huge white line out, which I hadn't had a good look at because he was up in the front of my canoe and I was in the back. I looked at this big, thick line, and we could see some rings on the water, which at that time I had not really connected with fish. I was plug caster mostly then. And what happened was that there was a hatch of flying ants flying from Virginia over into Maryland, and it's about a half a mile across there. And they were falling into the by the millions. And trout and bass both just love ants. Well, of course, all these rings were fish sipping. And he had a little fly on, which I now know was a black ghost streamer. And he just, ring would happen, he'd flip it out and catch a bass. He'd flip it out. It was like picking apples off a tree. I said, I've got to have some of this, you know. So the next day, I went to Baltimore, where Joe lived at that time, and I paid for it, but he bought me a reel and a rod and a line and gave me my first lesson. And I still have the reel. I don't know what happened to the rod, but I now wonder how I could ever cast with that tackle. The improvements in tackle have been incredible.
With you doing this with Joe, is that when you got the association? Because I know, didn't he give you a break in the writing field?
That was many years ago. Well,
that was later, or
what happened was that how I got into the writing field. That was with Joe was about 1947 or 48. In 1951, I was living in Central Maryland, and I used to go fishing with the editor of the local newspaper, which had about a 6,000 circulation. And I was catching more fish, and eventually I got to be an exhibition shooter for Remington Arms, so I was shooting more game and everything. And I had this reputation, and I went with this editor a number of times, and he suggested that I try writing an outdoor column. It's hard to believe this now, but there were only 4 hunting and fishing magazines in the United States at that time. There was a Sports Afield, Outdoor Life, Field and Stream, and a thing called Fur Fishing Game, which I don't even know if it's still in existence out west. But that was all, and there probably weren't 15 outdoor columnists in the country. So the field was wide open. And I have always written about technique. I got a high school education. I don't know how to write pretty and fancy, and really don't have any interest in it. And that's another field somebody else knows more about, so I never got into it. But I started writing this column for him, and within a couple months, I had 6 other newspapers in the region that wanted columns, so I was writing columns for them. Then I got into the magazine work, and then the guy at the Frederick paper where I went was one of the first of the photographers to use 35 millimeter cameras. They used to use the 2 1/4 Ryko-flexes and all that stuff.
Right.
If you look down, look out here.
You look down.
And so I was one of the very first ones to get in the outdoor running field, getting into 35 millimeter too. And then because
so that was your introduction to photography then?
That's right.
Then. Oh,
that's
okay.
right. And so what happened was I started writing in an area where there were almost no people doing it. What was really the trigger was that 7 million people, guys, had just come home from World War II.
Oh, boy.
And they all wanted to read about hunting and fishing. And in those days,
Sure.
you could go fish most any town. You could walk a mile out of town and
That's
get
right.
hunting fishing. So I happened to be in the right place at the right time. And then Joe gave me lots of advice on writing. For example, he always said, and I've followed ever since, never use a big word when you can use a small word.
Yeah.
And one of the things which I developed out of him, my own philosophy, is that I think the good writers and the good teachers never display knowledge, they share it. And over the years, I've noticed people who've gotten into the outdoor writing field who tend to share or tend to display their knowledge. For a while, they may do well because they have a lot of talent, but they irritate so many people that people walk away from them. I know, for example, a hip boot, for example, or people have trouble finding the end of the fly line, a leader in the fly.
Okay.
Well, years ago, I figured out that if you find the thinnest part of the leader and put a hook under it and wind it, it'll wind right around and come to the end, so you can find the leader. Well, if I would see somebody that was having trouble, I wouldn't walk up and say, let me show you what I do. I would walk up and say, let me show you something somebody else showed me. Then,
I see.
because I was as dumb as him, he didn't mind me showing him. But if I walked
somebody
up,
showed you.
that's what I'm saying about displaying knowledge. And the thing is that for about 7 years, I gathered a huge amount of information on knots back in the 60s. And I went up to visit Mark Sosin and another writer friend of mine, and we went in to see Dick Lyons, who was then outdoors editor for Crown Publishers. And I was telling him I really had about that much stacked information. I had tied like 90 knots and broke 30 of them, and then 6 months later broke 30 more, and then a year later broke the other 30 to see if they deteriorated under a long time. And actually, very, very little deterioration. But I had all this stuff. And Nick said, well, if you could get a book out in 3 months, he said, we could have it for the Christmas market. So I asked Mark if he came down to the house and would go over this with me, if he'd write the little bit of copy on it, I would find out how to take the pictures. And so we did this book. And the point I'm trying to make is that this is a story I tell young writers who come to me. We were allowed 40 knots in this book, and it had to be everything from an 8X tippet for trout to cable for marlin. We knew more than 40 knots, but Nick didn't want a book through.
Right.
So the book comes out with 40 knots. Well, every hummer that had a book knot that wasn't in this book showed me his knot. So 2 years, 5 years later, I know more knots than anybody ever met in my life. I'm a world expert. I don't want to be, but I already am, see. So I tell these young writers, I was out in Long Beach, California, and I showed 9 ways to connect a leader to a fly line. I didn't know anybody knew 9 ways. I thought I did a good job, and all my ways took 2 or 3 minutes. So, and I tell young writers this story. And I said, a little kid in the first row, about 12 years old, put his hand up. And I said, yes, son. He said, I think I got her better way. So he walked up, picked up a needle, fly line leader, went like this, and handed me a knot. It took about 10 seconds. And it was better than any of mine. So here's this world expert, 12-year-old kid showing him something better. And I turned around to the audience and said, you forget them 9 ways I found. And let's find out what this kid did. And the crowd just roared, and that's how I found out about what we call the speedy nail knot. But I learned it from a 12-year-old kid. But the point I was making, here's a guy who's a world expert on a subject, and a 12-year-old kid can teach him something he doesn't know. So all through my life, I figure everything I know is subject to change, and everybody I meet knows a whole lot of things I don't know, and I'm willing to learn them.
Yeah, and there's that honesty that goes through all of it.
Yeah, I think, and I never try to embarrass anybody with knowledge, or I like to kid them, you know.
I see you with the kids. You're fabulous with the kids. How about fly tying? Who introduced you to fly tying? Was it Joe Brooks too?
No, I started tying flies because all the flies that were around at that time were basically trout flies, and those great big old bass things that were back in the 1800s. So, and one of the what I almost regarded as a miracle at the time is I went up to Gettysburg, a guy named Gene Anderegg Gene Utek, and he tied a feather on and wound it on a hook. And when I saw those hackles go out, it was like a miracle. And the way that the Lefty Deceiver got developed in the late 1950s, I was fishing down at Crisfield, Maryland, in Chesapeake Bay with another writer, Tom Cofield, and they wouldn't allow you to do this today, but in those days, the crab picking plants would throw everything out the back when they were done at the end of the day that they didn't use. Well, this was a gigantic chum line. So be something like what they do in the dry Tortugas on the shrimp boat.
Right, exactly.
So we were in there and we would catch these striped bass, which we call rockfish, one after another, but almost all the flies in those days had feathers, or mostly feathers, or some bucktail up here, and of course they would underwrap on the hook all the time and ruin your cat.
Right.
So on the way home, I told Tom, I'm going to design a fly which won't foul.
Won't foul.
And so the back of the deceiver is tied way at the back, and then the collar makes a shape of a bait fish, but also protects that, and also leaves little currents that come off of it so that it makes the back of the fly work. And you could make it big or little, and you could also change the color combinations. And so I started out with...
What year was that?
That was to me it was just making a fly, so I don't remember. But I would say somewhere between 57 and 59. And because it was just another fly, so I didn't make any special note of it. But I realized that it was doing the job. And of course, the first Mylar that I ever saw, which we call Flash-a-boo and all that stuff, I was a very good friend of Mac McChristian, who used to make the Seamaster reels. And in 1964, Joe Brooks got me a job running the Met tournament at the Miami Herald, and I got to know Mac. And in about 1966 or 67, Mac got some Mylar from a place of all places in Czechoslovakia. I'm sure it came from this country, but that's where he got it. But it was 1 inch wide. And we'd put that on, and it worked, but nothing like it does now. But that's I never had any of that stuff on deceivers until that came
So
along.
most of the deceivers are just feathers and colors. They didn't have flash or anything.
Oh, they were just bucktail and feathers.
Right.
Yeah.
There are quite a few flies, even locally in our 10,000 Islands area, that borrow right directly on the deceiver. There's one called the 40, and you know what? They use no flash or anything. It's all...
Well, and there must be...
I
know there's a guy who did a book with 700 saltwater fly patterns, and somebody counted them up. I did, and they counted 19 different deceivers with somebody else's name on. But you can't do anything about that. So you don't fight what you can't do anything about. I don't worry about that anyway.
Yeah. Your books. You have so many books out. I've learned so much from your books.
Well, thank you.
Really, honestly. Anybody wanting to know anything about fly fishing or fly tying or knots or whatever, even the little knot book that you did with Mark Sosin is probably one of the most excellent little quick reference
sold
book.
Over 330,000 copies. I just finished another one, in fact, I just looked at the final galleys, and it's going to be out in February by Nick Lyons Publishers on presentation. And it covers trout fishing with emergers and snook in the mangroves.
Right.
And presentation is a whole lot more than just throwing the fly. It's like you wouldn't wear a white shirt like this on a green trout stream.
Right.
But you would wear this against the bright colored sky if you're standing up fishing for bonefish. And how you put the tackle together and what kind
People
of
don't think of those things sometimes.
No, but it all factors.
It all works.
And Nick thinks it's going to be a classic. He's real tickled about
photography in it?
It's all black and white.
All black and white.
To save money.
Yeah.
And I had to...
Well, the cost of the book is very reasonable. It's very reasonable. That's why people buy it. I think it's a very reasonable book.
This new book is going to be about $35, unfortunately, but it's going to be the same size as a typewriter page, and I've got all black and white because I didn't want to run the cost further up. And actually, I had to stop. I had 132,000 words, and I didn't really do much about offshore. I thought,
where do you stop?
You got to stop sometime. And very few people do a lot of offshore fishing that don't have somebody in a boat knows what to do anyway. So I didn't do much on offshore fishing at all, but I did an awful lot on inshore fishing. Things like I was pointing out in casting today, most people when they cast to a redfish or a bonefish look at the redfish and then throw the fly. And of course they hit the fly right on top of its head because you tend to throw where you look. But if a person would learn to look ahead or where they really wanted to go, their accuracy is going to improve. The whole book is just full of that kind of thing.
It's funny, people will bait fish and they will throw ahead, but they'll take a fly and bean a fly.
Or a lure.
Or a lure
right at
and hit
them,
them right on the head. Let's change the subject. If you had to go anywhere in the world and target it, like they said, Lefty, we got a plane sitting out here for you. We're going to take you where you want to go. What would be your most favorite thing to go fly fish for?
If up to about 7 or 8 years ago, I would have said New Guinea.
Really?
They have the strongest fish in the world there, called a New Guinea bass. You cannot catch one on less than 40-pound test line straight off the leader. And they live under trees and in the jungle. And I'd always written that saltwater bass are stronger than freshwater bass, but that ain't true, not with these fish anyway. They're actually in the same family as Cobera snapper, the Janus family. But what they do, they run out from underneath these trees, grab your fly, and go back. And the only way that you can catch them is when you set the hook, and I'm talking like 40-pound test right to the fly from the fly line. You can't use stronger because the fly lines aren't as strong.
Right.
When you stick the fish, you have to lap the line twice around the reel. I know this sounds like a fishing story, but it's true. Wrap it twice around the reel. The fellow throws the boat in reverse, and you drag the fish out in open water. Now, once he's in open water, it's 2 minutes. He's totally exhausted, but it's the damnedest 2 minutes you ever heard in your life.
I can
But
imagine.
they also have all kinds of other wonderful fish. They have threadfin salmon up to 40 pounds and all types of fish. But what happened in the last few years is the Japanese have been clear-cutting a lot of land in there.
You're kidding
And
me.
the Indonesians are using those big water hoses to wash gold out of the cliffs, and they ruined both the forest and the rivers. And many parts of New Guinea today are now so hostile because of this that
So they don't want outside people coming
there
in?
are
Is that
still
what
some
it
ways.
is?
I was at a place called the Bensback River 2 years ago. It's so remote that we asked a man for 2 watermelons that had a dugout, and he agreed. He was glad to give them to us if we brought the seeds back, because they don't have any stores, no roads, there's no communication. They're living like they did 2,000 years ago. But parts of New Guinea now are I guess my second favorite place would probably be the Bahamas for bonefish. I'd rather fish bonefish than anything
Really?
else.
That's true. Just for the speed,
Well, it's just
fight.
got everything.
It's got everything.
You
Sight
use light
casting,
tackle,
light
you're hunting,
tackle.
you're fishing, the fish are great.
What kind of rod do you like to use in that situation? Let's say it's not a howling, windy day.
I use 8-weight rods 90% of the time.
90% of the time.
You can, if you adjust your casting,
The
you
wind
can
is your
use-
friend, right?
Right.
The wind is your friend.
Exactly. And you know, you can use a 5 or 6 weight if you want, but and if you enjoy that, you should. I think the 8-weight is the ideal bonefish
It's the
rod.
perfect bonefish
Flip
rod.
Out and I've often talked about that.
I know he likes
Talking
the
about
8
that,
weights.
I know everybody that fly fishes now knows Clouser minnows, and I helped to develop that. Bob's one of my closest friends.
I was going to ask you about Bob.
Yeah, I just fished with
How
him.
did that relation? You're all from the same area.
Oh yeah,
right?
he
I mean,
lives just over the line in Pennsylvania, and one day he gave me one of these flies, which was nothing like what it looks now. It was just
Was
some
it more
lead eye.
sparse?
Oh,
Is it-
much sparser.
Okay.
And he said, had some luck on this yesterday. Try it. Well, I could see the potential. So we got together and we really developed a lot of this together. And but anyway, to date, I have caught, and it's the only time I've ever kept records on anything. I've caught 83 species of fish on the cloud. Now
That's incredible.
This is including, you know, Australia and South America and all over the place. But I've caught, in fact, one more, 84 species, because I hadn't caught a flounder on them until 2 weeks ago at Chesapeake Bay.
You're
So I've
kidding.
caught 84 species. It's the best single fly that's come along in a long, long time.
You can impart a lot of action to it. It's not that it's jig-like, but it is and it isn't. You know, it's...
Another fly we're having extraordinary luck is that Bob and I developed called a half and half, which we put on the back of the hook, we put like a deceiver fly
Right.
and a little bit of bucktail, and then come up front, turn it upside down, put the lead eyes on, turn it upside down, and build a clouser in the front. So what you have is a clouser in front, a deceiver in the back, and you can make a fly that's that long.
It doesn't
In fact,
foul.
I was in Costa Rica last week, and I caught...
With Andy Renzetti and...
Yeah,
yes.
and I caught 2 snook about 18 pounds on that half and half, yeah.
Yeah, Andy told me. He said, I went there, I brought my cameras, going to tape these guys, my camera locked up.
Yeah, well, it rained almost every day.
He said it was super humid.
Yeah, it really was.
Did you basically, in Costa Rica, snookfish, or were you just trying for everything? Tarpon, whatever you could do?
Well, I've
or?
caught so many tarpon that I don't have much interest in fighting big tarpon anymore. I'd much rather snookfish or bonefish or something. So I went there and caught mostly jungle species, machaca and mohair.
What kind of line were you using?
8-weight for most of it.
8-weight
Well, for the big
or?
snook, I used a teeny 300.
Oh,
because
okay.
these fish were, that's a good trick that some people might want to know. If you're a fly fisherman and you'd like to locate snook in deep channels, just troll with a deep running plug until you hook one.
Right, then you know where they are.
Put the anchor over, release that one if you want, and then go ahead and cast.
We fished with a captain in Belize. It was like that. He would drill fish, find them, and then we would use some of the teeny lines. Teeny's one of our sponsors, and it works real well.
Talking about Belize, guides. I'm going to write an article someday on funny things that guides say, but one that I thought
that would be a great book.
I think one of the funniest things I've ever heard was, guides tell you how shallow their boat will run. It'll run on dew and all.
Oh yeah.
Well, this
2
guy,
inches of water.
This guy beat them all. We were easing out over this reef, and I looked over and I saw all these coral heads down there, and I said to him, "Captain, how shallow will this boat run?" And he said, "Mr. Lefty, this boat will run where water was."
Incredible.
It don't get no shallower.
It doesn't get any shallower than that. That's incredible. What's a good fish story you tell me? What's something that sticks out in your mind? Some catch that happened to you.
One is kind of interesting. I was with Flip Pallet. I had caught 59 fish on a Clouser minnow. And I taught Flip to fly cast when he was a young man. We've known each other like brothers for years. And we always take a week off sometime. A lot of times with Ted Jurisic, it makes Billy Payton, T-Boy was in a fellow from Canada. And we were over at Andros Island Bonefish Club, and it was a kind of a rainy, drizzly day, and it stopped raining. So we went out, and visibility was terrible, and we could see a ray mudding. So I had just caught a bonefish, so I was standing up with Flip, and I said, there's a fish on that ray. He said, "Yeah, but it don't look like a bonefish." I had to cast to it anyway. So Flip throws over, hooked his fish, and it's a remora. And
he caught a remora?
Yeah, and
it hit a fly?
Well, here's the interesting part is, he said it's a remora, and it wasn't that big. It was only like 18, 20 inches long. And he's starting to bring it in. All of a sudden, his rod went down like crazy. The remora had went back and smacked his sucker on this ray. So now
he had the remora to the ray.
Yeah. Eventually, it broke loose, and we got it off. And then I said, "Quick, give me the rod." I had a little chartreuse and white Clouser on. They said, "Wow!" I said, "Give me the rod." So we got the remora quick, and I flipped out, and I caught another remora, which was my 60th fish on a Clouser, species on a Clouser.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Remora biting flies. Remora fly fishing. I can see that article.
It was fun.
Tell me about Lefty Regan.
Lefty Regan was a very, very dear friend of mine. He was the finest offshore captain that ever lived in Florida, in southern Florida. He knew about all those marlin off of Key West back in the 50s. He told me all about them. And Lefty, along with Dr. Webb Robinson, pioneered all this teasing for billfish and that sort of thing. But Lefty knew all those wrecks out in the Gulf. And he would run, for example, out to Northwest Channel, and when he got to the end of the rocks, the barrier, he would lock on Smith Shoal, which was 8 miles away, and whatever that compass reading was, he would not change it. But when he got to Smith Shoal, if this had drifted off like a quarter of a mile, 8 miles, we had 14 miles to get to the Lukenbach and Bazooka wrecks, but we didn't have no GPS.
There were no GPSs, Lorraine.
So he knew that if he ran 8 miles and it drifted off a half a mile, and he was going to run 14 miles, then he knew how to correct. So, and when you got, this is hard to believe, but in those days, when you got within a quarter of a mile of any of those wrecks out there in the Gulf, you were there because there was acres of fish all around these. I have pictures of Lee Cuddy hand feeding blue runners to cobia.
Incredible.
It was just acres, within 300 yards on all the way around a wreck were fish on the surface. So you knew that you were there before. You didn't have to find the wreck. All you did was find. And you'd go from one to the other, and nobody in those days ever fished. I went to the Marquesas with my kid in 1966 in a Boston whaler, and it was so remote that I took food and all along. It broke down, the motor broke down, and we sat on the south side of the Marquesas for 2.5 days till a lobster fisherman came by and picked us up and dragged us in. Now, we had plenty of food and water because I knew that might happen. But I was down fishing there last May and counted 14 guides working in the Marquesas where we broke down set. But in those days,
you were in the wilderness, basically.
Well, you could go down there and go into that east channel and come into the inside the Marquesas. If you did it right at dawn, there'd be thousands of tarpon and permit with their dorsals sticking out of water like picket fences all over. It was a paradise. It really was. Vic Dunaway and I started Florida Sportsman Magazine for Carl Wickstrom, and we've often said that the '60s was the golden age because we finally got good tackle. We finally got boats that would run in the grass because before they'd all just cavitate. We got. I designed the interior of the original Hughes boat. Okay. Bob Hughes, who I just visited, was one of my best friends.
People don't know that you did that, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, but we did. And so we finally had modern boats, good motors, good tackle, and we could go long distances. And so here was an area that virtually a lot of
totally a paradise,
almost unfished, and we just had a ball.
That's incredible.
It was fabulous.
For a bass fisherman from Maryland.
Oh, it was fabulous.
Yes. Did you live in Florida then for a while?
I lived from '64 to '73 in Florida. I did to '72. I worked at the Miami Herald. Then I was over an outdoor editor at St. Petersburg Times for a year. And then the Maryland, the Baltimore Sun, one of the biggest papers in the country, offered to double my salary and give me all kind of benefits.
To go back.
So it was just too good of a money deal not to pass up. Yeah. I hated leaving Florida.
Oh, I bet.
My wife didn't like it, but I loved it. She didn't like hot weather. I loved it.
She was glad to go back?
Yeah, I'd never live anywhere you can store meat outdoors 3 months a year.
So you didn't want to really leave.
No, but it ain't that cold. Where I live in eastern Maryland, we only get like 2 inches of snow twice a year, so it ain't bad. But I'd prefer staying in Florida. I really would.
Let's talk about fly casting. If you could give anybody a tip, especially beginning fly casters, what would be the tip you would give them? You know when somebody's first starting, they're struggling at casting.
Well, the first thing is if you're working at it, you ain't doing it right.
Okay.
The second thing is if you keep your elbow down here, when you raise your elbow, you start throwing energy up that's not going away, and it compounds all your casting problems. If you can take your arm back, the elbow, you can stop your hand going up, but if the elbow stays here, and this part of your arm does not get away from your body, not tight against your body like the old, but just hanging loose, just like if you're drinking water.
Right.
This moves, but it doesn't help you. If you drank with your whole arm, you couldn't. Cast with your whole arm, you can't. Just keeping that elbow at the same height is one of the most important things of all. It really is.
That's it. That's the tip you give them. One other thing I want to ask you. They call you Lefty. Okay? But you're a righty.
Well, two things. If you look at that arm, the muscles tore completely off of the arm.
Oh, yes.
I was flipping a mattress for my wife, and my arms were straight out, and it tore the muscle. She heard the muscle tear off the bone on the other side of the bed. A doctor at Johns Hopkins near where I live in Maryland told me that he repairs 8 or 10 a week, and they're almost all women. And the reason is that you're supposed to have a slight bend in your arms when you lift, and women will go to an airport, reach out for baggage, and pick it up with the single straight arm and pop the muscle off.
So it's a common injury then?
It's very common.
Very common.
Very common.
But it happened to you.
But to answer your question, I've been casting left and right. I cast left-handed for years, and then when I got into teaching casting, I realized that if you grab somebody's right hand with your left hand, it doesn't work the same way.
Right.
So I had to learn to cast right hand. So I cast with either hand. And in fact, at one time in demos, I used to cast 8 fly rods at one time and all that stuff. I quit all that stuff because that was just showing off. But anyway, I learned to cast right-handed because right-handers don't relate very well to a left-hander casting.
That's true.
So I do most of my demonstrations right-handed, although here both times today I was casting left-handed at one time or another just to show people. But it's a tremendous advantage to be able to fish with both hands.
So you can still cast with this arm?
Yeah, I can still throw 100 feet of line, but if I do it for any amount of time, all these muscles up here I'm not using. I'm using a little, it gets tiresome.
Right.
So I just, most of the time, just throw it right-handed.
That's incredible. How about fly tires? What's a tip you give them? I mean, everybody I know in my generation, and I grew up in Florida, Your saltwater tape, your original one, the first one, was like our guru thing. I mean, you know, we actually could see you really doing it, and we could understand and learn little tips. What's a tip you'd give a beginning fly tyer? They want to get into fly tying.
Well, one of the mistakes that they make is using too big a thread. I use, for most flies, I use no more than a size A thread or something like that. If you make 6 wraps with real thin thread, you have a much stronger bond than if you had 3 wraps with great big thread.
Right.
Plus, it makes big, ugly-looking heads and stuff like that. The best tip I can give you is, if you're really interested in it, is join a fly fishing club. And go to that club. And the crazy thing about fly tyers is they can't wait to teach somebody else to tie flies.
And all their little secrets.
Yeah,
and things that
and they share them with you.
Share them, it's wonderful.
So you can learn so much, and don't go buy fly tying kits.
Okay.
Fly tying kits are made up for everybody, and so they got a little bit of everything and not enough of anything. So if you go to a go to a fly fishing club, they have regular meetings, and a lot of the guys, they're tied, they'd love to, you know,
give you, and they give you stuff too.
Oh, absolutely.
I've gotten hackles and all kinds of things just given to me.
So that would be, if you really want to get into it, that would be the very best way to do it.
Well, Flip Pallet once was quoted as saying, you're really a national treasure, and there's no question about it.
Well, you can't believe Flip.
I believe him. He's a good guy, and you know what? I really appreciate you doing this with me and taking the time.
Where's
Thank
my
you.
ring?